Claire? Claire,
Yes, Charlotte.
do I start the broadcast?
Yes, you are live now.
Okay. Hi everyone, I hope you're keeping safe from COVID-19. Welcome to the 15th webinar of the series Green Brain of Greenpeace Africa. These are a series of webinars to help improve our participants on the current knowledge of environmental issues and give guidance on what actions one can be part of. I am your host, Charlene Kinyanji, a volunteer at Greenpeace Africa. To start off, kindly take a minute and introduce yourself in the chat section below, where you're from, the country, and institution. As you do, here are a few guidelines for the webinar. For any questions, please use the Q&A section. For any general communication, please use the chat section, and we shall run a poll at the end of the webinar. Kindly feel free to fill in the poll as it pops on your screen. And please note that the webinar is live on the Greenpeace Africa Facebook page. The conversation will also be on Twitter. Please use the hashtag climate emergency and climate action now. In today's webinar, we shall be discussing the current weather events and climate change in Africa. We are privileged to have 4 speakers: Ndoni Mcunu, a climate scientist and the founder of Black Women in Science from South Africa; Vanessa Nakate, a climate activist from Uganda; Hindou Ibrahim, the director of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad; Melita Steele, Greenpeace Africa Interim Program Director based in South Africa. Ndonu, over to you.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to have a presentation. I won't be long. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, we can, Ndonu. Please go on.
Great. So it's really a privilege. Oh gosh, I keep forgetting that I'm running it on my side. It's really a privilege and honor to be here today and to be able to share with you guys what I think and what the report has been discussed and has been written by Greenpeace and the team. And it's an honor for me to have actually participated in it. And so the whole point of the report today was actually just to talk about the extreme weather events which we are facing as a continent. And I think this is so important because we are the ones who are going to be having to deal with these extreme weather events. And we are the ones who are going to have to be the main communicators of the impacts of it. So my job today is just to go through the report, and then from there, we can have a conversation about it. So the take-home message from the report is one, that climate change is one of the biggest challenges that African societies are facing and will continue to face this country and beyond. I'm so sorry. I'm actually trying to see if I can minimize my screen, but I can't because I can't see the chat. But then the second point is, in 100 years, from 1900 to 2000, the continent has warmed on an average of 0.5 degrees Celsius, and the annual mean temperature has increased of the continents is projected to exceed 2 degrees or fall within the range of 3 degrees to 6 degrees. And I think this is a major concern that we have. Another important point is that many of African communities are vulnerable to the impacts of extreme weather events because of our limited ability to cope and adapt to these events. And these limited resources are like technology, skills development, economic capacity, to contribute to the low levels, and our ability to possibly adapt to these kind of changes. And one of the last points, and when you open the report, you will actually be able to see all of these points that are more than this. And the point is that there is a lack of data or existence of reliable data in most of the African continent over the past century. And it is difficult for us to reach conclusions about the trends and most notably the rainfall patterns. And I think this is so important because then it asks us the question to all of us as part of Africa, who then has been telling our story if we have had a lack of data over the years. And so then the report goes on to looking at an overview of the intensity and the frequency of extreme weather events. And here we look at heat waves, we look at droughts, we look at cyclones, we look at so many other events that have intensified over the years that have caused major impacts onto our African communities. So when you look into the right image over here, you can see droughts and what it actually means for communities. And this report and the picture at the bottom is just looking at the location, urbanization, and people migrating to different countries, what it actually means for us. And then we also look at what are the drivers of these extreme weather events in Africa. And here we look at reports such as your IPCC, we look at the Greenpeace report, the weather guards, and we actually look into what are the drivers in actually determining and communicating these extreme weather events and how we're actually reporting them. The next part of the presentation looks at how might these weather events affect in the future of climate change in Africa, the African weather. And this image is an aerial view of the flooding villages and land and the floods in Kenya. And this just shows some of the impacts. Anybody can see here that we don't have much of infrastructure, much of technology. And so these are the kind of impacts that we can actually start to see is flooding and the lack of adaptability that we might have within our communities. Another impact here, you can see that this is a showing of the heating overall that we can see. And when you look into the red side, majority of it is in Africa, meaning that we will have more intensified heat waves and the heating of our planet. And this can have a major impact in food security, in water accessibility. All of these can be impacted in Africa. Another impact that the report talks about is this image shows the standing of in a field of rice completely flooded in Central Africa Republic. And so if anybody who's in food security knows that rice is a main staple food for majority of the African continent. And so if we're experiencing this kind of flooding, this is bound to affect our food security and the access, therefore, to food in our African continents. Everybody knows mostly about the locust infection that we've had in Kenya that has affected also the food security. And this is because we don't have technology. The majority of our farmers are small scale farmers. Access to technology, access to capacity is a major issue. This is caused by the heating of our temperatures and brings in diseases. Warm temperatures bring in diseases into continents. And if we do not have the right mitigation tools or skills, then these kind of impacts affect our food security, our health, because if you're not eating right, you're not living right. And these are the kind of impacts that we can expect. And so the nice part of the report in conclusion for me is that there's a nice recommendation by Greenpeace Africa. And here we look into, and the nice thing is that the page is actually green. And this is actually very nice because when it's green, it means we are trying to not change the planet. And we're looking at the impacts and suggestions on weather and climate data and information. So the suggestion here says that we need to strengthen our existing databases and also see how we can monitor climate and African trends in Africa and extreme weather events in Africa from our side. How do we lead the conversation from our side? And I think that's important for us to talk about in terms of action. And then we look into land use and food security and forest. And we're saying here that our agriculture needs to be more ecologically safe. We need to look at extreme weather events. We need to look at how can our agricultural systems and our lands be more where farmers can be given more technology or access to skills and capacity to make sure that they are able to adapt to these extreme weather events. Another important part is the economical impacts and the well-being in the report that also talks about how do we link climate extreme weather events into the African community's economic well-being. And on our far in the middle, you can see this picture in that these are people who are having to be economically secure, but they are busy standing on a flooded market, they're standing on stones. And so these extreme weather events, whether we like it or not, will affect our economy. And how are we adjusting to this? Our oceans, we are requiring a more conservational outlook, and our leaders to make sure that they want to conserve our oceans. And in our energy, one of the major recommendations is for us to move into accessible electricity that is clean, that is renewable, and that is actually going to not put the health of our communities and our rural communities at risk. And so that's just the overview of the report. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ndonu. If a reminder that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A section. Over to Hindou. In Chad, extreme weather events are manifesting themselves in several ways and affecting the lives of people of Chad. What can you say about this?
Thank you very much, Sharon, and hi, everybody. And thank you for the presentation of the great report. All the points are covering already what I can share with you. So, when we talk about extreme weather events, maybe some people can look at it that we are exaggerating and just like it is in the report, it is just from time to time. But when you live in the ground, you see that it is the realities of the peoples. And I would like to share with you just some examples to see how we are moving in this last decade from an extreme weather to another one. So in Chad, we do have like 3 seasons, that what scientists said, like dry season, rain season, and it's more of the cold season. And those are moved to 2 because we have now a very long dry season with up to 48 degrees Celsius and 50 now because this year, 2020, we went through 50. And when you go in the desert, it's 54 degrees Celsius. And the rain season who become a much shorter with a heavy rain sometimes that create flood or not enough rain that create a drought. And this is exactly what is happening this year. We got all the flood around all the Sahel. And what you present in the report here, the photos of Nairobi in Central African Republic and all the places, it is the same in Chad. It is the same in Niger, in Khartoum, in our town city. So just yesterday, I received the photos that our cemeteries are floods and our streets turn it into the rivers. People use the canoe to displace from one neighborhood to another one. And it was 2013, we get also a big flood who create a peoples that becoming homeless. They lost them homes. To now, they couldn't get a house where they can live there. It is not the peoples that, just so we imagine, the peoples that I knew personally also, who was part of this impact of the flood of 2013. And then now in 2020, we are going to have a numbers of the peoples that displaced by the flood who will be adding to those who are already homeless. So imagine the consequence. And when you move 4 months ago, Just when we was in the COVID crisis, and then the world turned to the virtual world where everyone have to use the internet and the computers or telephone to get connected. I was not able to do it. Why? Because my computers and my phone getting so hot, I have to put with me a ice bag every 15 minutes, that I have to put my computers and put my phone in the fridge before to get back and do this kind of webinars. And that's also the reason why I couldn't at all connect with the people to share what is happening. And then I moved to come to a better internet place. So how about the communities who cannot move, who depend from the land, from the season, who depend from the rainfall to feed them families? And I'm talking here about my peoples, my communities, who are the Mbororo pastoralists, the cattle herders, who move from one place to another one to find water and pastures. And around all the Sahel now, we are turning into conflict among ourselves between farmers, fishermen, and pastoralists to get access to the shrinking resources. Just so because all the weather becomes so extreme, and then it's so very hard to have a productive land or to have a piece of water that can be stay a longer term that people can use, and then they have to fight because of these extreme weather events. But what we can do in our communities, we always use our traditional knowledge to cope from this extreme weather, but you cannot hide from 50 degrees Celsius. It is impossible. When you walk on the street, you feel your body is burning. So even you can get an umbrella cannot protect you, but we can have trees that can maybe only the one who can help to mitigate this heat and protect us. But there is not enough efforts. And then the life of peoples depend from that, and it's killing already peoples. That's why we have the multiple of diseases. Even before coronavirus, we do have a lot of disease. And now it is the time of malaria. All our regions, you call everyone, they say like, oh, we are doing well, but everyone is lying down because of malaria, and people are dying because of malaria. What's take the malaria in this stage in very, very high? All the hospitals are full. In addition to the COVID, it is the flooding going around. And by the end of the flooding, we are moving to have another pandemic who can be a diarrhea for all the peoples. And then because the land that have the wet, who have wet, just like drying up, and then this shrinking water, people will drink it. So until when we are going to continuously from this extreme weather event to another one, losing our season, losing our crops, creating the food insecurities, and creating conflict between communities. So we need to act. That's why I'm so honored with my sister Vanessa and all the rest of you who joining us to asking the head of state of the 54 African countries to declare a climate urgency. It is an emergency that we are living on it, and we cannot pardon them that our communities be continuously living in this kind of extreme weather events. We need them to act. We need them to declare it. We need them to take a concrete action to the communities. I wanted to see my peoples to not suffer from the flood or from the drought. I wanted to see my peoples that coping with the life that they have, living in harmony each other, creating the better share of the natural resources. And we cannot do it if we cannot stand up in this letter and request them to have these urgencies, and request them to integrate the green recovery that can integrate the peoples, the management of the resources, and that can integrate the climate solutions as fast as possible. We want it when? We want it now. We want to act when? We wanted to act since yesterday. So that's mean the action might follow immediately after this panel. All the head of state, all the government decision makers, and especially all the business peoples, you have to stop making our life worse. We are already dying, so it is not an excuse. Shift your business to the sustainable way of management. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindou, for the insight on the climate emergency. I hope the audience is asking questions and taking note on how serious the issue is. Hindou, could you tell us more? Is the government doing enough to protect the people of Chad from these extreme weather events? And what do you think they can do to protect them?
So I think from the extreme weather event, people is struggling from themselves. Because when we can compare, like when we have the COVID, people have to wear the mask. If they go to the street, they didn't wear the mask, what is happening? The police arrest them and they have to pay a fee. But if there is someone who damaged the environment, he can walk away without anything that happening to him. And when you have also the peoples who are now homeless because of the drought, or homeless because of the floods, or who do not have a food, what was the response? Just the emergency response as humanitarian, giving them the piece of rice or piece of oil. And how about the rest of the days? How about the rest of the months? How about the rest of the years? How they can build back better? I think the action that they are responding are not enough. They need to change radically. They need to change the policy at the national level. All our countries, and especially I can say Chad also, ratified, signed the Paris Agreement. I wanted to see them turn this Paris Agreement into a national legislation that can ask everyone in the country, in all the regions, to see how they can integrate climate change adaptation and mitigation in the national or regional or local plan of development. I wanted to see how they can move from the support just as humanitarian after a flood or after a drought, to a special pillars that to protect peoples, to protect them by restoring the land, to invest on agroecology, to invest on corridor, on land management, to invest on how the peoples can use better the traditional knowledge, the science knowledge, the technology, all together to build them on resilience. I wanted them to see, to move from the meetings that they organize, from the car that they are buying with the money of the project, to the communities that need it, especially the women who are in my communities, the youth who wanted to see them features, to do not migrate to another regions, but to stay there and see them feature is designed in them homeland and create the sustainable way of living by living this next 7 generation. I will end here by share with you what we are doing in my community. When you're born, you have to know your 7 past generations, like my dad, my grandfather, my great grandfather, until 7 of them. I have to know them names. I have to know what they did and how they do it. And when I'm going to take any decisions that can help me to things to the 7 next upcoming generation. So that's not only to my children's, but imagine the 7 next upcoming generations, at least it's going to be like 500 years or 1,000 of years that I have to think. And that's way of living, how we can protect our environment and leaving it to the next generations can help us better manage. And government must think about the long-term solutions and think about the action right now. We can't wait anymore because we're already the front lines.
Thank you, Hindou. It's true, we are living in a climate emergency. And to raise more people to view this webinar, please use the hashtag climate emergency and climate action now. Thank you, Hindou, again for the valid, strong point. To Vanessa Nakate, you're a young climate activist from Uganda, and could you tell us why you are at the forefront of advocating for climate change in Africa?
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be speaking today. But then I'm really more happy after listening to Hindou and Ndoni and everything that they have explained. Honestly, they have spoken out my heart. They have spoken out everything that I think is very important and that I think everyone needs to know. But just to add on that, we know our continent, the African continent, it is one of the least emitters of CO2 emissions, and yet it is among the most affected by the climate crisis. knowing that fact should be a wake-up call for the citizens and also for the leaders to understand that they are facing impacts of challenges that they didn't bring upon themselves. Our African continent and most of its countries, they heavily depend on natural resources for survival. That is for food, that is for water, and we understand that climate change affects these resources. We understand that people's livelihoods are affected when these resources are not in their right place, when these resources are affected by the climate crisis. With the increasing global temperatures, of course, Africa faces a much bigger risk, like you have had in the reports that Ndoni has read. And this is going to cause or is already causing massive disruption in weather patterns, hence the floods, the heavy floods that we are seeing in different parts of the continent. Because in places where we used to receive regular, reliable rainfall, it now comes in form of short and heavy rainfall, bringing about the floods. And then areas that are experiencing intense heat and also long and hotter dry spells, you realize that climate change has a direct impact on the food security and the water security of many parts of the African continent. And to me, I feel like these are just the primary impacts of the climate crisis. What we will see that maybe East Africa is facing massive floods or a massive invasion of locusts that is destroying food. And also, you hear about the hot, dry spells, maybe in Southern Africa, and how they are struggling to have access to water and how their crops are drying up. And you hear about the floods in Chad, you hear about the food scarcity in Nigeria, and many other parts of the continent. But then when you get to think about what I call the secondary impacts that follow after these primary impacts, that is something that really pushes me to demand for action. Because what happens to a family when they have lost their farm, when they have lost their home because of a climate disaster? What happens to the children? What happens to the girl child? Most of the women and the girls, they have been given society roles of taking care of house chores, especially in our continent. And you find that they are responsible for putting food on the table, putting water on the table. And that means in the case of an occurrence of a climate disaster, if there is a water stress, they will have to walk long distances to collect that water. And we can't deny the fact that this exposes them to gender based violence. They have to work double the work they've been doing to put back food and recover from the losses that they have experienced. And many times, the girl child is forced to drop out of school to help their mother in recovering and rebuilding up from everything that has been lost. And I think that is something that people really need to understand, that we cannot have issues like gender equality without addressing the issues of climate change, because climate change only exacerbates these challenges that women and girls are already facing. And also, communities that have, or countries that have tried to build themselves up, when crisis happens, most of them are pushed back to almost face the consequences of climate change. And
Vanessa, maybe you could try reconnecting. I
yes,
think
please.
I know you're back. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can. Yes, clearly.
Yes, thank you. I just want to emphasize that this is an urgent matter. This is an issue that affects every sector of our lives. This is an issue that affects our present. This is an issue that is going to affect our future. We won't be able to eradicate poverty in our countries without addressing climate change, because when people lose their farms, when people lose their homes, when people lose their businesses, they are kept in a poverty trap that keeps on going on like a cycle. We won't achieve zero hunger. Um, Countries like Somalia, people are almost half of the population has no access to food because of these disasters. So how can we achieve zero hunger if the people have no access to food? And also, we can't ignore the fact that we're going to see more conflicts, because the more the resources are limited and many people need to use them, maybe the water resources, the more the chances of conflicts in communities, the more the chances of migrations in different countries. I will give an example. I read about Lake Chad, and realizing that it has shrunk to tenth of its size in only 50 years is disturbing. And yet, the people who need the water resources, the water from this lake, they they continue to, they continue to rise, I would say. So many people continue to need this water, and yet the lake continues to shrink. So this really puts such communities in places of conflict, in places of struggling for resources. That is why I think it's important for the African continent to wake up right now and tell their own story and demand their own action. Because if we do not fight for ourselves, no one is going to fight for us. If we do not demand for the action we need ourselves, no one is going to do it for us. If we have to write letters to our leaders, then let's do that. If we have to go out and protest, then let's do that. If we have to pressure the leaders in our countries, in the international community, let's do that, because it is our future that is at stake. You may say, I will not be affected by climate change. But if you are not affected by climate change, probably your grandchild will be affected, or your great grandchild. So you think about what you are leaving for the coming generations. We cannot compromise the resources of the coming generations. We cannot allow corporations to continue destroying our planet, to continue choosing greed and money over the people and the planet. Because at the end of it all, we need these life support systems. We cannot even eat this money or in a dead planet. We cannot even see these corporations make profits on a dead planet. There's something I said, we can't even have music on a dead planet. So I feel like the first priority should be protecting our people and also protecting the planet. And the only way we can protect the planet is by protecting the life support systems. Those are the ecosystems that we have, our forests, our lakes, our oceans, so that we can have a future that is livable, so that we can inherit a future that is sustainable, so we can be in a world whereby people are happy, in a world whereby children don't have to sleep hungry, in a world whereby girls don't have to be forced to drop out of school or don't have to be forced to get married because their parents have lost everything to these disasters, in a world whereby you can smile, in a world whereby I can smile, in a world whereby every child and everyone can smile, and every animal and the entire planet can smile. That is the kind of world I envision, one that is livable, one that is healthy, one that is sustainable, one that is equitable. And The only way that we can do this is by using our voices and using our resources to demand for this action from our leaders. We have to do everything we can to secure our future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vanessa. You've talked so much about the planet and about our audience's understanding on the climate emergency. You've talked about protecting our people. And if we look at majority of the activists, you, Greta, Lisa, everyone is so young. And what does this mean for young people? Could you tell us more on that?
Well,
Can you
I mean,
connect?
yes, I mean, it means a lot for the young people because it is our future that is at stake. We go to school, but then we study for careers, but then you think about the future that you are going to inherit, and you ask yourself whether you'll be able to practice that specific career that you're studying in a future that is so uncertain. You worry about the children you give birth to and the world they will have to inherit. So it has everything to do with the future. It has everything to do with our livelihoods that we are trying to protect. We've seen the danger, we've seen the crisis. It hasn't just come now, it has been here, and it only keeps getting worse. And what we are trying to do is to secure the future that we are walking into, because we do not want to inherit disaster. We do not want to inherit greed. We do not want to inherit oil. We don't want to inherit coal. We want to inherit life. And the only way we can do that is by speaking up and doing all these strikes, protests, signing petitions, writing letters in a way of getting the future that we want.
Thank you. As young people, we have the tool of social media, and please raise your voice and using the hashtag climate emergency and climate action. Thank you, Vanessa, for speaking on this. And I hope you can learn from her as a young climate activist and as you can take action as she does. To Melita, can you please explain what Greenpeace Africa calls in regards to these extreme weather events in Africa? Melita?
Thank you. So I think one of the important things to talk about is when I started working for Greenpeace Africa nearly 11 years ago, we talked about climate change. But just in the last few years, the language has changed quite significantly. And instead of climate change, we're talking about global heating, we're talking about the climate crisis, we're talking about the climate emergency. And the reason for that is because what we are facing is exactly what Vanessa and Hindou and Ndoni have outlined, which is an existential crisis, a crisis that could actually affect our ability as humanity to survive on this planet. And I think that's very important, that the language that we use matters. And it's really important to remember that this is a crisis. And it's also important to remember that although we might be facing floods and droughts on a much more regular basis, there is nothing normal or natural or inevitable about extreme weather events. And it's critical that we don't just accept this as the norm and are willing to take action and stand together. The link between burning fossil fuels and the climate crisis is very clear and is backed by science. And I think it's also important to remember that this is a human-made problem, and it requires us to come together as humanity to find the solutions. it's also important to remember that the climate crisis doesn't affect us all equally. In fact, the climate crisis acts as a threat multiplier, taking existing vulnerabilities like poverty and inequality and gender injustice, and it makes them worse. And extreme weather events are a clear manifestation of the climate crisis. So it's important to remember that taking action now will prevent communities in the future from facing the next disaster. Although we live on the African continent, not every country is the same. And I think it's just important to point to the role that South Africa in particular plays as the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases on the continent. And the reason for that is because of the country's extreme reliance on coal. And as such, South Africa has a specific responsibility to act to reduce its emissions and shift away from coal in order to protect everybody else who's living on the African continent. It's clear that we need a new development pathway in Africa that avoids extractivism and fossil fuels, and instead is able to maximize on the potential and opportunities around renewable energy. So we're super lucky on the African continent in that we have some of the best renewable energy resources in the world. But unfortunately, our governments are still pulled towards fossil fuels and extractivism. And we need to actually focus on shifting away from that mindset and building our resilience and avoiding the fossil fuel trap. And in fact, governments should be prioritizing universal access to energy and electricity through renewable energy on the continent. In terms of what Greenpeace Africa is advocating, we run campaigns on climate and energy, on protecting our forests in the Congo Basin, on protecting our oceans along the West African coast, and on food security and ecological farming. So in terms of what we work on and what we're saying needs to happen, oceans are a key carbon sink, and we need an agreed and unified approach to ocean protection by African countries, which should go as far as protecting 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. We also believe that African countries need to develop a holistic approach to agriculture and forests, which can achieve both food security and forest protection at the same time. And in terms of this, ecological farming is key in terms of local food production and actually making sure that we are resilient. It's really important to remember that we can't talk about social justice in isolation from environmental justice. And I think Vanessa was pointing to that in talking about we can't have gender equality on a dead planet. We can't have equality and justice on a dead planet. And so we must prioritize an integrated and intersectional approach to the climate crisis by prioritizing resilience and economic development pathways that are built on green jobs and ending energy poverty while protecting our natural resources. There's no doubt, and this report makes clear, that the African continent is highly vulnerable to the impacts of global heating. But that doesn't mean that we should just sit down and say, okay, it's over for us. African governments have a big opportunity to act now through declaring a climate emergency, through removing the barriers to renewable energy, and through protecting our oceans and our forests while ensuring that we have food security on the continent. So in terms of what you can do, in terms of this very big existential crisis, what is the action that can be taken? So you can sign on to our letter to African leaders, calling them to declare a climate emergency. And we can share the link with you in the chat for that. You can also support the people who are here on this webinar, talking to us about their own activism and their own work on the climate crisis. So find and follow Vanessa, Hindou, and Ndoni. They're blazing a trail on the African continent in terms of taking action on the climate crisis. You can also support Greenpeace Africa through donating to us. We don't accept any money from governments or corporations to maintain our independence. And that means that we're 100% reliant on individuals donating to us every month. You can also volunteer with us, and you can also just look for us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and follow us and take action with us together. I think the take-home message here is that in a world that seems to be going like increasingly wild, with many pressures and many challenges and many crises, we do believe that the climate crisis is a serious, deep crisis that needs to be prioritized and centralized. And we shouldn't feel disempowered in the face of the climate crisis. In fact, we should feel empowered to take action together and to push for change together. Thank you.
Thank you, Melita, for explaining the reports and for telling us what actions you can take. I hope you take a note. We'll go over to the Q&A section to answer all your questions. Over to you, Kipto. Kipto. Kipto, are you ready to ask the questions?
Okay. Sorry for that, Shalin. Sorry, everyone. So the first question is from Lucky in Facebook, and this I will address to Ndoni. So he's asking, why is the weather degeneration attributed to gum tree plantation, more so plantation by rural Black citizens? Did you get that, Ndoni? Over to you.
Sorry, can you repeat the beginning?
Oh, okay, so he's asking, why is the weather degeneration attributed to gum tree plantation, more so plantation by rural Black citizens?
That's a tough question. I don't want to act like an expert on gum tree, but I would anticipate that the way that it, I don't know, absorbs water, maybe the way that it's, how the tree actually absorbs water and takes up water, maybe that's the reason why, but I wouldn't know. I'm so sorry.
Kipto, I think you're mute. Kipto, please unmute. To Hindu, the question is, has the level of poverty impacted on extreme weather changes in place? If yes, how? Hindu, has the level, have you had, okay.
Thank you for the question. So I think the extreme weather even increase the poverty. And you know, we have more than 70 to 80% of the population depending from the agriculture, from the fishery, or from the pastoralists. And all those three areas are the main income as economy, and also are the demand for the food to feeding the families. And when you have extreme weather event, it's impact those activities, it's impact the productions. And then now when you didn't product well, so you cannot have enough for your families, and you cannot sell to have an income. So that increase the poverties. I give you the example of the milk. You know, I'm coming from pastoral communities. We used to milk like morning and evening during the rain season, and during the dry season once every day. But now with the extreme weather events, during the dry season, while it is very hot and there is not enough pastures, we milk only once every 2 days. The first of the day we milk, the second day we leave the milk to the baby cows. So that reduces our income and reduce also our foods to more than in half, because the quantity reduce, and then you know, it's not enough to feed our families, then to sell to have another money. So that increase the poverty, of course. And if you have flood, it is the same, because your crop flood, and at the end of the day you do not get a productions to sell or to feed your families. For sure that the extreme weather event is adding poverty to poverty every day, and that's why our countries is still in a big pathway of poor peoples.
Thanks, Hindu. The next question. This is about the report. So I think Melita, you can take it. So the person is asking, how does the report suggest involvement of youth and women in solving the problems of climate in most areas around the Great Lakes?
So I think the role of women and youth is critical. We don't specifically go into that in the report directly in much detail, but the Vanessa is part of the global climate strikes movement. And in fact, she's probably the best place to answer about the role of youth. But from my position, what I would say is it's very clear that the impact that youth can make in terms of actually seeing that the science is real and taking action is incredibly important. The visibility that youth are able to push for, the uncompromising approach in terms of saying, this is our future and you have to protect it, is really critical globally. And there's no doubt that women, as often heading households by themselves and being on the front lines of climate change, have a really important role in terms of building our resilience and driving the action that is required to protect our futures.
Thank you for that, Melita. And now that you mentioned Vanessa and the incredible work that she does about climate change, maybe Vanessa, I'll direct this question from Linda to you. And she's asking, what measures are we, the African nations, taking from these extreme weather conditions? And she goes ahead to ask, what coping mechanisms are put in place for this menace? And then she finishes again by saying, most countries have their own policies. Are they fully implemented?
Thank you for that question. We have seen many policies that are put on paper, but sadly, we never see them implemented. And we have seen African governments have turned a blind eye and a deaf ear to the climate strikes, to the climate movement. And we have seen how they act like there are no young people demanding for action. So I don't think we have received much action from African leaders as they have been silent on these issues. What I've seen, they have the basics of what they can do about climate change, because every time they talk about climate change, the first thing or the only thing that is mentioned is planting trees, which is good. But climate change is more than planting trees. Yeah, it's much more than that. And I've also seen governments announce days for planting like 1 million trees in their regions, but then we never get accountability for these trees. Because if you are planting maybe millions of trees on those specific days, then why does the forest cover continue to reduce? So there is so much question on how much our leaders are doing in regards to climate action, and that is why the voices of the young people are needed to get accountability and to find out if the leaders are actually implementing the policies that they put on paper. But the fact that they are silent about the climate movement, about the climate activists who are speaking up, says a lot.
Brilliant answer, Nakate, Vanessa. Thank you so much for that. And I would come back to you, Ndoni. Maybe you can weigh in your thoughts on this. I know you maybe you're not from Kenya, you're not familiar with this, but Cyprian is asking, can Kenya's flooding lakes of Rift Valley be linked to climate change? What do you think?
Can they what?
The
Sorry?
flooding of the lakes.
Yes,
Can
definitely.
Kenya's flooding lakes?
Yes. So I think the challenge that we have when we speak about climate change, as I said, is the data. And so we don't have enough historical data to directly link our extreme weather events to say it's climate change for sure. And that's why when we speak about climate change, we say it's uncertain. But when we look at the frequency of extreme weather events, it seems like it is linked to the changing climate. So we can link the flooding, we can link the locust effects to say that due to these extreme weather events that have happened within a year's period, then we can say it could be due to climate change. And I think that's why it's so important that from this meeting, we take the most important thing in that we are responsible for the information at which we share to the world. And so the way that we can be responsible is by gathering this kind of information. And so if you are a Kenyan and you are seeing that there is a flooding and you have a question mark about it, it's up to you to take action and write about it and talk about it and ask people about it. That these are the kind of events that we are seeing alongside with your locust impacts. So if the media wants to talk about locusts, they will talk about locusts. But you as a Kenyan, if you are seeing a frequency of flooding, then it's up to you to do so. And so I think we can definitely say there is some kind of a link, but in the case of all climate change situations, we need longer historical data. And when we're looking at Africa, we just don't have enough. Cool.
Thank you, Ndoni. Good. And the last question that I would like to forward to Melita is about Greenpeace. How can one be a member or join the organization? That's Greenpeace.
So Greenpeace Africa has a presence in South Africa, Kenya, Cameroon, DRC, and Senegal. And so we have teams on the ground there. And so if you go to our website, so just search for Greenpeace Africa, you'll be able to find any vacancies that we might have listed there. But I think connecting with Greenpeace is like can happen working for the organization, but it can also happen through volunteering, and you can look on our website for that. And I think the key point is that we're really striving for environmental justice across the continent, connected with social justice. And connecting with us is an excellent way to do that. Connecting with the climate strike movement is also an excellent way to do that.
Thanks, Melita. And the last question now goes to both Hindu and Doni. And Kuzai asks, how do we get African climate science expertise and indigenous knowledge, that is the traditional ecological knowledge, to be part of the decision-making processes for governments to develop climate action plans? So maybe Hindu, you could go, and then Doni will weigh in her thoughts also. Thanks.
Thank you, Kito. Kudzai, this is a very important question. While we are talking about how we can build solutions, we need to come all together in partnership, and having scientists who can come with the modern knowledge and indigenous peoples who will come with the ancestral old knowledge of managing our environment is really very important. But your question is how they can be listened from them, how the politicians can include them in the decision makings. I think this is where our challenge are. If the government listen from the science, maybe we will not be in this emergency to now. Because the first report of the IPCC, it was before I get born, 99, that the scientists start saying, hey, the world, look at here, you need to reduce your emissions. And no one listened to them. So we have 30 years now, and we is still increasing all the carbon into the atmospheres. And indigenous peoples, we have been ignored completely until the Paris agreements that they say, oh, your knowledge are very important because you are keeping the 80% of the world biodiversity. So we wanted to have your knowledge. But they don't want to recognize our rights because our knowledge are ecosystemic based. So the knowledge of the forest are very specific to the forest, to the savannas is the same, to the mountain is the same, glaciers is the same. And indigenous peoples live around all those different ecosystems. I think the way that we can make the inclusiveness of the science and indigenous peoples and make our voice here, it's showing them the evidence that we work together. And then one of the examples is the 3D participatory mapping, where we challenge the world, put the traditional knowledge, the people who didn't went to school, but who know better than environment, and the scientists in the geographical information lines and technology, and show them, you see this map, and when you see the 3D participatory mapping and you see the satellite mapping, the 3D mapping is much detailed with the reality. And then we ask the politicians, if you do not include us, your climate policies will not work at all. So maybe if we use a strategic way, that can help our voice to get included into the policy making. But for sure, I think also my sister Ndoni will give us how we can really make that a reality. Thank you.
I think I definitely agree with Hindu is in what she just said, is that the first thing is that we need to unify, and we need to know that we all have to have one goal. That's the first thing. And the goal is that how do we get our voices out? Not just to say we are Africans, but also to come up with the facts. And I think that requires a unity. So how right now we have had a conversation with me as a scientist, with an activist like Vanessa, with Millicent, who's working also in Melita, who's also working in climate action and Greenpeace, and Hindou, who's also working in climate activism. We need all to come together and have a conversation and respect each other as Africans to say, this person who knows whose expertise is science, and this person, her expertise is climate activism, and try to see where do we all meet each other in the middle ground is important. So it's more like an integrated learning. And the first thing that Hindou said was, there is information from years ago, but it's not being communicated. And I think there needs to be a stronger force from us as Africans to communicate what is on the ground. And once we start communicating it, what we'll find is a lot of maybe African scientists, like your indigenous knowledge guys, like your traditional ecological knowledge systems, will start to question that on the ground and say, but wait a minute, that's not what I'm experiencing on the ground. And so we need to say, how do we get the information that is already on the ground to people, and then let people actually speak about the information and say, are you actually experiencing this? And when you realize that, then you'll start to say, who are the African experts that are already doing research on this, that can actually agree with this or oppose to this? And I think that's the way that we need to actually start to do it. And the only way we can do that is to make sure that our voices are just as strong and unified, and we are saying one message as Africans.
Thank you, Ndoni. I think there's one last question from Facebook, and this I would just directs to Melita, and it's being asked, how does this extreme weather climate affect the future agriculture economy in Africa? And how can farmers positively contribute to this issue with Greenpeace? Over to you, Melita. Did you get that?
I did get that. Thank you. So I think one of the issues for the African continent is that we are so reliant on agriculture in our countries to actually supply the food that we eat, that food security becomes critically important. Unfortunately, what the climate crisis is doing is making things like rainfall much more unpredictable and much more extreme. And so you will have heard, I think Ndoni mentioned climate change adaptation. So part of that is, there are two things around the climate crisis. The one is mitigation. So we need to reduce the emissions of CO2 and greenhouse gases. And the second one is adaptation. We need to find the ways to build resilience and adapt to the reality that we're already living with the climate crisis. And so when it comes to agriculture, avoiding mass industrial agriculture is probably one of the ways to adapt. We need to build our resilience. We need to invest in things like ecological farming. We need to localize our food production. But you'll find that even farmers are affected by the kinds of seeds that they used to use no longer working. Agricultural zones and precipitation rainfall zones are actually changing. So what that means is that we need the support on the African continent to adapt and to build our resilience. And I think that's definitely something that we should be able to unite behind on the African continent, which is to say that our food security is critical. And if the climate crisis is having such a major impact, then we have to pressurize our governments to make sure that we're building our resilience and we're investing in ecological farming.
Okay, thank you so much, Melita. And amazing knowledge and feedback from all of you, Melita, Ndoni, Hindou, and Vanessa. Thank you so much. So over to you, Shalin.
A huge thank you to our speakers and to our participants for your questions. Please do take a minute to fill in the poll on your screen if you haven't. And this webinar has been recorded, and the link to the recording will be shared if requested. Thank you again for being part of this discussion, and we hope to see you again in the next webinar. Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye. Bye.